What if I told you that a single caliber could not only survive wars, revolutions, and nearly a century of technological change, but also become the backbone of Soviet firepower across land, sea, and air? We're talking about the 130mm cannon, a weapon so adaptable that it armed dreadnoughts, Soviet destroyers, experimental heavy tanks, long-range field guns, and even futuristic coastal systems. Today, we're going to dive deep into the story of this caliber, where it came from, how it evolved, and why it became one of the most enduring and intriguing weapons in Russian and Soviet history. B-7, the gun that started it all. At the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Russia fell from the world's third to the sixth naval power, forcing its focus back to the Baltic Fleet, whose primary mission became defending St. Petersburg against Germany. In response, Tsar Nicholas II created a naval general staff in 1906, at first emphasizing submarines and mine warfare. The Bosnian crisis of 1909, however, triggered a broader rearmament program. Orders soon followed for the Ganget-class battleships in the Baltic and the Imperatrica Maria-class dreadnoughts in the Black Sea, part of a naval program that consumed over 500 million rubles between 1906 and 1913. Much of this expansion depended on foreign firms, with ships like the cruiser Rurik and heavy machinery ordered from abroad, especially Germany and Britain, a reliance that became a serious problem once World War I broke out and deliveries were interrupted. Beyond financial costs, the program was also driven by rising tensions with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the Baltic and with the Ottoman Empire in the Black Sea, sharpening the sense of vulnerability of Russia's coasts. Despite these efforts, Russia still lacked the industrial capacity to fully supply its own navy without foreign assistance, which delayed shipbuilding and slowed the introduction of modern armaments. Within this strategic and industrial context, the Naval General Staff sought a reliable medium-caliber gun that could balance range, rate of fire, and production cost, a requirement that would soon lead to the adoption of the 130mm 55 pattern 1913. The 130mm B-7 was formally accepted by the Main Directorate of Shipbuilding in 1912, and in 1913, the Obukhov factory received an order to produce 471 units. An additional 100 were contracted from Vickers in Britain, delivered as the Mark A and Mark B. Although these British-built guns were constructed with slightly different manufacturing methods, their ballistic performance remained identical to the Russian version. Yet by 1917, the Naval Department had received only 117 guns in total. Most of these were used to rearm cruisers and battleships, such as the Diana-class and the Imperatrica Maria-class dreadnoughts. The gun itself was designated the 130mm 55 pattern 1913, reflecting its 55 caliber barrel length, and it was designed to fire a 37-kilogram projectile at a muzzle velocity of about 823 meters per second, giving a maximum range of 16 kilometers. In comparison with earlier Russian naval artillery, the B-7 was deliberately designed to be simpler and cheaper to manufacture, while still balancing range, accuracy, and rate of fire. During the 1920s and 1930s, the B-7 underwent a series of modifications intended to extend its service life and keep it competitive with newer designs. A spring-assisted rammer was introduced, increasing the sustained rate of fire from about 5 to 8 rounds per minute. New mounts with higher elevation were also fitted by 1930, which extended the gun's maximum effective range. Experimental efforts even considered the adoption of polygonal rifling in 1931, but this was abandoned in favor of simply deepening the grooves from 1mm to 2mm, which greatly increased barrel life. Accompanied by minor modifications in fire control integration and mounting systems, ensuring the gun remained reliable in service under the Index B-7. In terms of deployment, the B-7 proved versatile beyond its original role aboard dreadnoughts and cruisers. By 1923, at least 12 of the guns had been installed in fixed coastal batteries, including positions in Odessa and along the Caucasus shoreline. Others were retained on modernized warships or transferred to auxiliary vessels, providing the Soviet Navy with a standardized medium-caliber weapon during a period of scarce resources and industrial rebuilding. One of the clearest demonstrations of the B-7's adaptability came during the Russian Civil War. The armored cruiser Ochakov, originally launched in 1902, had been modernized by 1917 with 14 130mm guns along with additional anti-aircraft weapons. Renamed Kagul, the ship took part in a landing operation on the Kerch Peninsula in June 1919. Embarking 160 soldiers of the 52nd Vilnius Regiment and supported by a British destroyer, the cruiser landed troops near Koktebel without resistance, then advanced inland toward the village of Nasipnoye. Throughout the operation, Kagul provided fire support against Red Army positions near Stary Krim, firing 20 rounds at ranges of up to 17 kilometers and later delivering 67 high-explosive and 4 shrapnel shells in direct coordination with advancing troops. Such episodes highlighted the practical value of the B-7. It was a gun simple enough to manufacture in quantity, versatile enough to arm dreadnoughts, cruisers, gunboats, and coastal batteries, and reliable enough to remain in combat use across multiple conflicts. Its operational record extended well into the interwar years, bridging the Imperial and Soviet periods and laying the foundation for the new generation of 130mm weapons. B-13, Stalin's workhorse. Between 1930 and 1935, the Soviet Union found itself in a world unsettled by economic collapse and rising authoritarian powers. The Great Depression crippled much of the global economy, but within the USSR, Stalin's first 5-year plan drove rapid industrialization, even as collectivization devastated agriculture and triggered widespread famine. Internationally, the political climate was shifting. In Germany, Hitler rose to power in 1933 and began openly defying the Treaty of Versailles through rearmament. In Italy, Mussolini invested in a systematic modernization of the Regia Marina, building new cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, though his explicit imperial ambitions in the Mediterranean would only emerge later in the decade. In Asia, Japan's 1931 invasion of Manchuria deeply alarmed Moscow, serving as a clear signal that Soviet interests in the Far East were under potential threat, even if open clashes lay years ahead. Amid these global pressures, Moscow turned to its own naval ambitions. The Naval Shipbuilding Program, first approved in 1926, had already launched the Dekabris-class submarines under Boris Mikhailovich Malinin and paved the way for over 100 more subs to follow. By the early 1930s, the creation of the Pacific Fleet and the Northern Fleet underscored the USSR's intent to project power in new theaters, while modernization of existing cruisers and battleships was also underway. These expanding demands revealed the shortcomings of the old 130mm Model 1913 gun and set the stage for its successor, the 130mm B-13. By the late 1920s, the Soviet Navy required a new deck gun for submarines that could match the ballistics of the B-7, intended for the emerging Pravda class. The first design was the 130mm 45, featuring increased bore pressure, cartridge loading, a semi-automatic horizontal wedge breech, a hydro pneumatic throw-type rammer, and manual cartridge handling. Over the next 2 years, however, the project changed radically due to shifting naval requirements, modifications to the Pravda submarines during construction, and financial limitations. As a result, the weapon only reached prototype stage in early 1934. Testing quickly revealed serious flaws: a low rate of fire, extremely short service life, and frequent failures in its automation systems. After a round of revisions, the gun was accepted into service in December 1935 and standardized the following year as the 130mm 50, pattern 1936. The greatest weakness remained barrel longevity. Even after production began, multiple institutes introduced their own rifling solutions, which created a major logistical failure: 3 different patterns of the same gun, each requiring unique shells, firing tables, and sights. By early 1941, a total of 378 B-13 guns had been built with mixed rifling, about 20 with the original 1mm deep grooves, which gave a barrel life of just 130 rounds. a small number from the Naval Artillery Research Institute with 1.95 millimeter grooves, and the majority from Research Institute number 13 with 2.7 millimeter grooves, extending barrel life to about 1,100 rounds. Only later did the adoption of replaceable liners standardize the system and make the gun more practical in the field. The B-13 also received different designations depending on its shield configuration. In 1939, mounts with a box-shaped shield were designated B-13-1C, while those with a streamlined shield became B-13-2 later that same year. In 1948, production of the third series, B-13-3, introduced a modified ramming device that improved reliability. These designations did not indicate entirely new models, but rather production modifications to improve efficiency and protection. Despite its troubled development, the B-13 offered impressive versatility. It could fire a wide range of ammunition, semi-armor piercing shells, high-explosive grenades, diving shells, illuminating rounds, and later, even anti-radar projectiles. Most rounds left the barrel at 870 meters per second, with a maximum range of about 25 kilometers and a practical rate of fire between 6 and 13 rounds per minute, depending on the mount and crew efficiency. It became the standard armament for nearly all Soviet destroyers of the Second World War, classes such as Leningrad, Nevny, Ognavoy, and Skory, while also equipping coastal batteries and rail-mounted guns. Several major twin-gun variants expanded its use. The B-2LM, a twin-turret version weighing about 49 tons, became the standard destroyer armament in multiple projects and modernization programs. The B-2LMT was a heavily armored derivative designed for the massive river monitors Perekop and Sivesh, which survived the war and remained in service until the 1960s. The B-28, developed around the same time, was installed on the monitor Hassan, but never produced in numbers, as the simpler B-2LM was prioritized. The final variant, the B-2U, was an ambitious universal twin mount with a new 55 caliber barrel, higher elevation suitable for anti-aircraft fire, and a lighter overall design. However, with the war ending before its development could be completed, the project was abandoned. As for ground service, the B-13 had to wait for a suitable land vehicle, since the gun was originally intended for ships and coastal batteries. By 1938, the 5-turreted T-35 heavy tank was already considered obsolete, and Soviet planners demanded a new breakthrough vehicle with greater mobility and protection, capable of resisting 37 to 45 millimeter anti-tank guns at point-blank range, and even 75 millimeter guns at ranges of up to 1,200 meters. Two competing designs were presented: the SMK, developed by the Kirov plant, and the Product 100, designed by the Leningrad Experimental Machine Building Plant, number 185. In July 1939, the prototype of the T-100 was completed. After initial ground trials, it was quickly dispatched to the Karelian Isthmus at the outbreak of the Winter War for frontline testing under real battlefield conditions. Its combat performance proved impressive. According to the designer of combat vehicles, both the T-100 and the SMK demonstrated strong armor and durability in action, confirming the T-100 as a well-protected and effective vehicle for the role. Building on this experience, Soviet engineers recognized that the massive hull of the T-100 could also serve as the foundation for specialized engineering or heavy assault vehicles. In December 1939, the Military Council of the Northwestern Front instructed Plant Number 185 to develop such a machine, initially considering a 152 millimeter gun for destroying Finnish pillboxes. When that plan was abandoned, the naval 130 millimeter B-13 was proposed instead. This marked the beginning of several ambitious projects that tried to transform the T-100 chassis into heavy self-propelled guns. The T-100X, later renamed T-100U and best known as the SU-100Y, was the only one to advance beyond mock-ups and into a full prototype, mounting the naval B-13. Another concept, the T-100Z, envisioned a rear-mounted 152 mm M10 howitzer, but only the gun itself was completed. The Project 103, or T-103, was conceived as a heavy tank mounting a fully rotating turret with the B-13, designed to provide extreme firepower against fortified positions and enemy armor, though it remained only as a wooden model. A final concept, the T-100V, aimed to mount the massive 203mm B-4 howitzer, but it never left the drawing board. Further work on the T-100 family was canceled with the conclusion of the Winter War and the adoption of the KV-1. Yet the debate did not end there. The official conclusion was that the T-100 met the required performance characteristics, but was unnecessary since the KV was already in production and adoption. Plant number 185 disagreed, arguing that the T-100 belonged to a different class and offered advantages in armament, cross-country mobility, and operational range. Most importantly, its larger chassis could mount a 130mm naval gun, something the KV could not accommodate. Despite this dissenting opinion, the KV-1 was chosen, and the T-100 program quietly faded away. On March 14, 1940, the SU-100Y was completed. Built on the chassis of the T-100 heavy tank, it reused many of its components, but introduced a massive fixed casemate armed with the B-13 naval gun. Power came from a GAM-34 engine, delivering 850 horsepower, reaching up to 890 under certain conditions. The crew consisted of 6 men, a driver, a radio operator, 2 loaders, a commander, and a gunner. The vehicle carried no defensive machine guns and relied entirely on its main weapon. The casemate itself was a boxy structure with 60 millimeters of armor all around, providing basic protection while keeping weight manageable. Testing took place in the Kiev Special Military District under ideal proving ground conditions, alongside the KV-2 heavy tank and the 2 SU-14 prototypes. Some later accounts suggest that the SU-100Y may have participated in the defense of Moscow in 1941, operating in the same sector as the surviving Su-14s, though this remains uncertain and is not confirmed by primary sources. Although it never entered series production, the Su-100Y represented a bold attempt to transform a naval gun into a mobile fortress. Today, it survives as a unique exhibit at the Kubinka Tank Museum, standing as a bridge between interwar experiments and the later generation of Soviet heavy assault guns, culminating in the Su-152. S-26, naval firepower on tracks. Between 1940 and 1941, the Soviet Union found itself in a contradictory position on the world stage. After its costly victory in the Winter War against Finland, Moscow expanded its territory by annexing the Baltic states, Bessarabia, and eastern Poland under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On paper, the USSR looked stronger, but in reality it stood diplomatically isolated. To the west, it seemed a willing accomplice of Nazi Germany, while to Berlin, it was nothing more than a temporary partner of convenience. Meanwhile, the fall of France in 1940 and the rapid expansion of the Axis in Europe convinced Stalin that he needed time to rebuild the Red Army and modernize its equipment before an inevitable war. This fragile sense of security gave way in late 1941 when Operation Barbarossa advanced deep into Soviet territory but was eventually checked by the counteroffensive during the Battle of Moscow, the first major German defeat of the war. Until the design of the next 130mm ground gun could begin, there was a hiatus caused by the German invasion of the Soviet Union. While naval artillery would continue to rely on the B-13 for a long time, its ground counterpart had to wait. To understand the origins of the B-13's successor on land, we must first look at its platform, the Su-152. Between 1940 and 1943, numerous prototypes for breakthrough tanks, pillbox destroyers, and self-propelled guns were designed. The combat experience gained with the T-34 medium and KV heavy tanks gave Soviet designers enough knowledge to push firepower further and create vehicles to fill tactical gaps. Both the T-34 and the KV family, though formidable at the start of the war, quickly became harder to maintain as their components showed reliability issues. The KV-2, which initially served as a pillbox destroyer, was overloaded and plagued by mechanical problems, particularly in its transmission. And even during the Winter War, it had already shown limitations in deep snow. By late 1941 and early 1942, new designs based on the KV chassis appeared. The KV-13 was an experimental attempt to improve the KV-1, with a more powerful ZIS 576mm gun, serving as a stepping stone toward later IS tank developments. But it was not fundamentally superior in terms of performance. The KV-7 attempted to increase firepower with two 45mm guns alongside a central 76mm, but it was impractical in service. More ambitious designs followed, some of which looked far ahead of their time. In mid-1942, Soviet designers proposed heavily armed KV-based vehicles, mounting the 152mm ML-20 howitzer. These concepts suffered from poor component reliability and remained on paper. That same year, the loss of the Stalingrad tractor plant and plant number 264 delayed further work on heavy pillbox destroyers. To meet immediate battlefield needs, the SU-122 was built to provide artillery support until a more powerful solution could be produced. By the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943, the need for a mobile, heavy, self-propelled gun became critical. Operations Uranus and Saturn, as well as the final stages of the Battle of Stalingrad, highlighted the decisive role of artillery under extreme conditions. A special design team was formed at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant under Order Number 764 of the People's Commissariat of the Tank Industry. Within just 25 days, they produced the KV-14, mounting a modified ML-20 gun howitzer on a KV-1 chassis. Completed on January 24, 1943, the prototype was quickly accepted into service on February 9th under the name SU-152. The year 1943 was a period of experimentation. Initially based on the KV-1S chassis, the SU-152 was effective but limited. By the second half of the year, trials began with the IS-85 tank, later adopted as the IS-1. Transitional hybrids like the KV-85 appeared, while the SU-152 entered mass production. A total of 670 units were produced between February and December 1943, with a few completed in early 1944. However, even before its production peaked, the SU-152 was already becoming obsolete. On May 25, 1943, requirements were issued for a new vehicle with better protection, firepower, crew comfort, and visibility. A prototype referred to as IS-152 was created, but in practice this designation led directly to Object 241, built on the IS chassis. By November 6, 1943, the ISU-152 was accepted for service. Overall, the ISU-152 proved to be one of the most successful heavy self-propelled artillery units of the war. Its 90mm sloped frontal armor could withstand the German 75mm PaK-40 at 800 meters. It was easy to repair, reliable after initial problems, and versatile enough to serve both as heavy assault artillery and, in practice, as a tank destroyer. Production continued after the war, and the vehicle remained in service until 1986. Remarkably, a few were even used during the Chernobyl disaster response, though this is more of an anecdotal footnote to its long service life. Because of its reliability, the ISU chassis became the basis for multiple modernization programs. In mid-1944, the High Power program aimed to develop ISU-based heavy self-propelled guns, capable of defeating the most heavily armored German vehicles, such as the Tiger II, Elephant, and Jagdtiger. 5 prototypes emerged. Object 243, armed with the 122mm BL-9, a lengthened version of the A-19S, but ultimately too powerful for the platform. Object 251, armed with the 122mm S-26-1, similar in ballistics to the BL-9, but also considered excessive. Objects 246 and 247, mounting the 152mm BL-8 and BL-10 guns, respectively. Both offered high firepower but failed due to poor maneuverability, unwieldy barrel length, recoil, and barrel integrity problems, and weak structural robustness. Object 250, armed with the new 130mm S-26, adapted from the Naval B-13 gun, representing a new caliber direction for Soviet self-propelled guns. None of these vehicles were accepted for service. The excessive barrel length, nearly 5 meters, reduced maneuverability in urban and forested terrain, while logistical difficulties with heavy ammunition and repeated failures in durability tests further complicated adoption. By late 1944, refinements were attempted, but with the war's end approaching and the targets they were designed to fight increasingly rare, the program was abandoned. In effect, the high-power program concluded alongside the war itself. These guns developed under the program laid the groundwork for the next generation of vehicles, especially heavy tanks, designed at the end of the war and carried into the early stages of the Cold War. S-70, SM-2, M-46, KS-30. 1 caliber, 4 battlefields. Between 1943 and 1945, the world was already heading toward exhaustion. By the end of the Second World War in May 1945, nearly every great power was financially strained, its cities scarred, and its industries either ruined or stretched to the limit. Britain was bankrupt. France was only beginning to rebuild after occupation. Germany and Japan lay devastated. The United States stood apart with its economy intact, but even Washington was rethinking priorities in a new world divided by ideology. For the Soviet Union, victory came at an enormous cost. Over 20 million dead, vast stretches of territory destroyed, and entire cities needing to be rebuilt from rubble. Yet the USSR also emerged as a land empire, stretching farther west than ever before, and as the central military power on the Eurasian continent. Stalin's government saw both the opportunity and the danger. On one side, weakened European neighbors that could be influenced or absorbed. On the other, the rising tension with the United States that quickly defined the early Cold War. This moment of simultaneous ruin and ambition drove Soviet planners to think beyond immediate reconstruction. They sought weapons not just to replace wartime losses, but to guarantee military superiority in the decades to come. On the ground, tank designers debated calibers above 122 millimeters, producing specifications in June 1945 for an ultimate heavy tank that explicitly included a 130 millimeter option. In artillery, wartime lessons highlighted the need for longer reach, prompting orders in 1946 for a new long-range gun. In the skies, the appearance of jet bombers forced requirements for a heavy anti-aircraft piece in 1947. At sea, the Navy, gutted by wartime attrition, launched a rearmament plan in 1945 that called for a universal destroyer mount, again centered on 130 millimeters. Together, these post-war realities show how, in a world where nearly everyone was broken but the USSR refused to pause, 4 different branches, tank, field artillery, air defense, and navy, converged on the 130 millimeter caliber. Each had its own immediate justification, but all were shaped by the same duality: a devastated country determined to rearm faster than its rivals, and a leadership convinced that only ambitious new weapons could secure the Soviet Union's place in the post-1945 order. Plans for a heavy tank with a 130 millimeter gun slipped into the post-war period, largely because Soviet ground forces relied on the 122 millimeter for reliability. Formal work toward a 130 millimeter requirement began on the 4th of June, 1945, spurred by the discovery of the German Typ 205 Maus. According to the early specification, the new vehicle could mount either a 122 millimeter or 152 millimeter gun, withstand German 88 to 105 millimeters fire at 1,200 meters per second, and reach 60 kilometers per hour with a 1,000 to 1,200 horsepower power plant while staying under 55 tons. That ambition dated back to November 1943 and generated designs so bold that many remained drawings or mock-ups. A few did reach metal: IS-6, IS-4, IS-3, And before any final production design, there were more than 30 drawings and proposed variants across existing and experimental vehicles. With Maus now on the table, these ambitions hardened into requirements for an ultimate heavy tank. The effort crystallized as Object 257, an ambitious diamond-shaped chassis built around the BL-13 gun. Design work wrapped on the 6th of June 1945. Just 5 days later, 11th of June 1945, the bar rose, armament revised to 122 millimeters or 130 millimeters at 1,000 meters per second. Mass increased to 60 tons, crew to 5, and armor to be immune to the German 128 millimeter. Even before those stricter demands, the 257 was formidable. Compact and well protected, it carried a BL-13-1 with a tested autoloader, delivering 7 to 8 rounds per minute. Figures called for 55 tons, 50 kilometers per hour, an electric transmission, suspension derived from Object 253, and 2 V16F engines, producing 1,200 horsepower in total, with 590 liters of fuel. The diamond hull geometry gave excellent resistance against 88mm and 105mm German guns. Ultimately, though, Object 257 was canceled for no longer meeting the updated requirements, yet it heavily influenced the designs that followed. Progress in Chelyabinsk moved in parallel with Tank 705, Object 705, a concept with more angular armor and provisions for both BL-13 and S-26. Heavily armored and similar to the 257 in many respects, it weighed roughly 10 tons more and placed its turret at the rear. Some sources even rate its protection on par with the IS-7. Despite the promising paper specs, 705 never left the drawing board and was canceled, overshadowed by the IS-7. Designated Object 260, the IS-7 appeared at the end of 1945 as a wooden mock-up. A behemoth claimed to be immune to its own gun, yet showing the agility of a tuned medium tank. The first IS-7, model 1946, initially mounted the S-26 with a different muzzle brake, used an autoloader with a 6-round ready rack to deliver 6 to 8 rounds per minute, carried 5 machine guns, a 14.5mm on the commander's cupola plus 4, 7.62mm, and ran a TD-30 rated at 1,200 horsepower, all at 66 tons. In 1947, the platform upgraded to the S-70 cannon, a better version of the S-26, switched to the M50T engine, and received modest improvements. Refinements to the family also explored heavy self-propelled guns on the same base. Proposals included the Object 261 family, Object 269, and Object 263, none progressing beyond wooden mock-ups and drawings. For Object 263, engineers considered an improved S-70A featuring a more effective muzzle brake, a heavier breech for balance, and an increased maximum vertical aiming angle of 30 degrees. Even so, none reached construction. At its peak, the IS-7 stood as the pinnacle of Soviet heavy tanks, but a doctrinal shift ended the program after only 7 prototypes. An order for 50 placed with the Kirov factory in 1949 was never completed due to funding limits and a broader transition to cheaper medium tanks within the Soviet defense industry. The story of the SM-2 began in late 1943, when Anami issued requirements for a twin universal mount. The design drew inspiration from the German SKC 33 105mm twin mounts fitted on Admiral Hipper-class cruisers. The first complete prototype was only ready in 1949, and it was chosen for the upcoming Project 41 destroyer, a fusion of concepts from Project 48 and Project 40, aiming to create the ideal Soviet destroyer after the massive wartime losses. On the 15th of August, 1945, the Soviet Union launched a 10-year naval rearmament plan that envisioned more than 300 destroyers. While yards rushed to replenish numbers with the obsolete Project 30-biz Skory class, the more ambitious Project 41 Neustrashmy was already taking shape. Designed in 1947 and launched in 1952, New Strashemy represented a leap forward. NBC protection, advanced fire control, better seakeeping, reduced fuel consumption, and a much cleaner design than the scory it was meant to replace. Alongside it ran the conservative Project 56, Kotlin class. While New Strashemy pushed boundaries, Project 56 opted for cheaper, less ambitious solutions. It sacrificed endurance, survivability, and modernization potential, and these shortcomings became painfully clear during later refits, like the conversion into Project 56K Bravey. The first SM-2 turrets were delivered to New Strashemy in 1955, and 28 more went to the Kotlin destroyers, which became the main platform for the system. The SM-2-1 was a twin 130mm mount that gave Soviet destroyers remarkable versatility. Each barrel could fire 12 to 15 shells per minute, could engage surface targets up to 30 kilometers, and reach aircraft at altitudes of 21 kilometers, even when flying at jet speeds. Guided by the Sfera 56 fire control system, which combined radar, optics, and electromechanical computers, it provided effective long-range gunnery and reliable air defense for the 1950s. Its magazines carried a wide variety of ammunition: armor-piercing, high-explosive, anti-aircraft, illumination, and later even special anti-submarine shells. Like many ambitious Soviet designs, the SM-2 did not remain a single, isolated system. As the Navy tested the mount in service, designers explored spin-offs and evolutions for different roles. SM-4, 1956, coastal defense version of the SM-2. Adapted for shore batteries, it retained the same ballistic performance, but in a fixed, protected mount. It reportedly saw service during the Korean War. SM-62, an automatic analog developed in the mid-1950s. It was intended for late-series Kotlin destroyers and Project 68 Bias cruisers, but was canceled when missile armament took priority. A few later ships of Project 57 tested the system. The SM-2-1 was one of those ambitious Soviet projects that worked, but also revealed limits. The mounts were complex, stabilization had teething troubles, and modernization prospects were better on the clean-sheet New Strashemy than on the Kotlin class. Nevertheless, the SM-2 kept Soviet destroyers competitive until the arrival of missile-armed designs. In April 1946, the Soviet Army issued a requirement to replace its aging heavy field pieces, among them the 122mm A, 19 and 152mm ML-20. The answer came from factory number 172, a new long-range gun designated M46. Though technically a land weapon, its design philosophy drew on naval gunnery traditions, especially the 130mm B-13, which explains its unusually long barrel and high muzzle velocity for the era. The gun entered production in 1951 and was first shown publicly in 1954. In Soviet service, it became the primary long-range counter-battery piece of the 1950s, and through export, it spread worldwide. It equipped at least 25 countries, eventually being manufactured in China as the Type 59. The improved Type 59-1 combined the M46 barrel with the carriage of the Type 60, reducing weight to just 6.3 tons while retaining full range. Egypt built its own licensed version, the M59-1M, and for export, the Chinese even offered redesigned carriages with auxiliary power units, as well as a self-propelled gun based on the Type 83 SPH chassis. Several other countries improvised their own self-propelled solutions. Cuba fitted the gun to T-34 chassis into heavy 6x6 trucks. India built the Vijayanta-based SP-130 catapult, while North Korea and Vietnam each fielded their own truck or tank-based conversions. In practice, nearly every operator developed local modifications, proof of both the gun's versatility and its longevity. The M46 was a true long-range gun, mounted on a sturdy split-trail carriage with detachable spades. The gun offered 50 degrees of traverse and enough stability to absorb its high-velocity punch. Sights followed the standard Soviet pattern, allowing one man laying with a direct-fire telescope and panoramic dial sight, later complemented by the APN-3 for night engagements. For travel, The barrel was drawn back between the trails and locked, the 8-man crew able to bring it into action in about 4 minutes. It fired separate loading ammunition, with the core being a 33-kilogram HE frag shell, but also smoke, illumination, AP, and later APHE, and extended range rounds. With its 930 meters per second muzzle velocity, the gun reached nearly 28 kilometers, and with base bleed or rocket assist, this stretched to 38 to 40. A trained crew could sustain 5 to 6 rounds a minute, surging briefly to 7 or 8, and Soviet doctrine allocated 80 rounds as a basic unit of fire. The M-46 embodied the transfer of naval gunnery traditions into the field army, combining the long barrel and high muzzle velocity of the B-13 with the practicality of a towed weapon. In service, it proved to be powerful, versatile, and widely adaptable, becoming one of the most produced and exported 130mm gun in history. Beyond its Soviet career, it served with dozens of nations, appeared in countless local variants, and was even mounted on tanks, trucks, and experimental self-propelled platforms. Decades after its introduction, the M-46 remains in service in some parts of the world, a lasting testament to how a well-balanced design can outlive its era. The KS-30 was the Soviet Union's ultimate attempt at a heavy anti-aircraft gun before missiles took over. Designed in the late 1940s as a successor to the 100mm KS-19, it was meant to knock down bombers flying at stratospheric heights, up to 19 to 20 kilometers. In 1947, the program appeared under the label 130mm Mobile Gun with SSP, and although its lineage is uncertain, the requirements were clear. Fire a 33.4 kilogram shell at an initial velocity of 970 meters per second to reach a ceiling of 20 kilometers. The main artillery directorate approved the project as the KS-30, and by 1948, the first 8 prototypes were built. Testing revealed mechanical problems, forcing redesigns in 1950 and further refinements in 1953, including changes to the rifling for barrel life. In 1956, Plant Number 172 even proposed radical improvements, such as raising muzzle velocity to 1,100 meters per second, increasing traverse and elevation speeds, and adding automatic corrections for barrel tilt. Ambitious ideas that show how far the Soviets wanted to push the platform. Technically, the KS-30 was impressive. The massive mount, weighing over 20 tons, sat on a cruciform platform with folding outriggers, while traversing on a large ball race for stability. Hydraulic actuators provided automatic aiming but could be switched to semi-automatic or manual control. The system could be towed by ATT artillery tractors or heavy 6x6 trucks, and a full battery required external power stations, cable networks, and the GSP-130 data system to coordinate up to 8 guns. The weapon fired fixed-charge, separate loading ammunition unique to the KS-30, not compatible with the M-46 field gun or the SM-41 coastal gun. Shells included high explosive fragmentation with time or proximity fuses, illumination, and even APHE. Fired at 970 meters per second, they could reach nearly 28 kilometers in range and a vertical ceiling of about 20 kilometers. Operationally, the KS-30 was deployed in batteries around high-priority targets in cities, usually controlled by PUAZO fire directors and SON-9 fire can radars. In theory, a well-coordinated battery could put heavy fire into the flight path of high-altitude bombers. In practice, the gun's enormous weight limited its mobility. Radar tracking of low or fast targets was difficult, and accuracy at the extreme ceiling suffered from shell dispersion. Production ran from 1951 to 1957, with about 328 guns completed. Though overshadowed quickly by the SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile, the KS-30 did see service abroad. Exported to allies, it appeared in the Vietnam War and the Iran-Iraq War, usually in fixed batteries rather than mobile deployments. The KS-30 thus stands as both the peak and the end of the line for Soviet heavy anti-aircraft guns, a massive, technically advanced system built for a very specific moment in air defense, just before missiles rendered such artillery obsolete. M-65, the last giant of Soviet heavy tanks. The T-10 was the final tank of the IS family, the ultimate evolution intended to outperform all predecessors, and to solve problems such as weight, armor protection, reliability, cross-country mobility, and maneuverability in a heavy tank platform. The T-10 was one of the most advanced heavy tanks of the time, designed initially as the IS-5 in 1944. The program aimed to field the newest Soviet heavy tank. In 1953, the IS-5 was renamed T-10 after Stalin's death, and it was later that year accepted into service. The T-10 entered service already under the perception that it might be insufficient against contemporary threats, despite the upgrades and variants using its chassis. After 3 years of production, a new requirement was issued by the Main Armored Directorate, with the following specifications of the new tank being: weighing about 52 to 55 tons, a 130mm rifled gun with an initial projectile velocity of approximately 1,000 meters per second, engine power of approximately 1,000 horsepower. 3 designs were submitted in response, 2 from the Kirov plant in Leningrad, and 1 from the Chelyabinsk plant in Chelyabinsk. These designs were the final evolution of combat experience and forward-looking weapons concepts in the form of a mobile heavy tank, with the Kirov plant's designs being the Object 277 and Object 279, and the Chelyabinsk plant designing the Object 770. All of these vehicles were armed with the same weapon, the 130mm M65, designed by SKB-172. This gun had a barrel almost 7.3 meters long and weighed about 4.3 tons, making it one of the largest tank guns ever built in the Soviet Union. It was fitted with the Groza 2-plane stabilizer, and each vehicle that carried it had some form of assisted auto-loading loading system adapted to its turret layout. The M65 fired both armor-piercing high-explosive and high-explosive shells, with variable propellant charges to adjust performance. During its development, an APFS-DS round was reportedly created, though surviving data is scarce, and it remains unclear how extensively it was tested. In total, only about 10 of these guns were produced. Some secondary sources even mention a proposed 140mm derivative, the so-called M65GL, intended for follow-on heavy tank destroyers and linked to the objects 277, 278, 279, and 770. Now for the vehicles. Each design was iconic. The Object 277 was an elongated version of the T-10 and was inspired by it for the hull and turret, being essentially a refined successor to the last heavy tank, with most of the parts of the tank being cast for better weight management, durability, and the ability to achieve the desired armor angles. The 277 had a 14.5mm KPVT machine gun, coaxially mounted next to the main gun, a crew of 4, night vision devices, a rangefinder, an automated fire control system, a semi-automatic cassette-type loading mechanism, and protective features against nuclear threats. The weight of this tank was 55 tons, powered by a 62-liter, 1,090 horsepower M850 V12, an upgraded version of the M50T used by the IS-7, achieving a top speed of about 55 kilometers per hour. Only 2 prototypes were built, and another version was planned, the Object 278, which was almost the same as the 277 but was planned to use a gas turbine producing 1,000 horsepower and weighing 53.5 tons. The Object 279, more widely known as the Apocalypse tank, was the most ambitious project among them, having an all-cast structure. The hull had an elliptical form to maximize deflection of incoming enemy shells, and it was composed of an inner armored capsule and outer panels, aimed at improving resistance to heat projectiles. The tank also had protection against nuclear effects to protect the crew, its shape being designed to better absorb blast overpressure and shockwaves. Because of the iconic shape, the suspension was engineered for improved mobility over soft or broken terrain, so the tank had 4 tracks with hydropneumatic suspension, a layout informed by previous trials on Object 726. The tank was equipped with a 1,000 horsepower diesel engine and weighed about 60 tons, being capable of 55 kilometers per hour. The tank was also equipped with the coaxial 14.5mm machine gun. The Object 279 was considered by many enthusiasts the best tank among them, claimed to be surpassed in protection only by later designs, such as the T-80, and probably among the most advanced heavy tanks of the era in potential and technology. Also, the Object 279 had multiple other proposed upgrades, but due to the political context, the source where I found the upgrades was censored. Readers with access to Domestic Armored Vehicles, 1945 to 1965 by M.V. Pavlov and I.V. Pavlov may find additional project references, which is where this information came from. Only one tank was produced, though several turrets were reportedly built for tests. The Object 770 was the last of them, and overall better than the 277 in comparative assessments. It had 4 crew members and a distinct, largely cast hull, an experimental diesel engine reaching 1,000 horsepower, and the tank overall weighed about 55 tons. Despite being another prototype for the request, among the 3 tanks, the Object 770 was considered the most promising, with 1 prototype produced. All of these tanks shared common qualities such as crew comfort to Soviet standards, an automatic fire extinguishing system, thermal smoke equipment, night vision devices, rangefinders, the coaxial 14.5mm machine gun, a radio set, and other systems, all being projected to be lethal on the battlefield while providing crew comfort within Soviet norms. Among all of these promising projects, none of them were accepted for service, because Nikita Khrushchev became the Soviet premier in 1953 after the death of Joseph Stalin. Khrushchev placed a large emphasis on adopting new technologies and believed lightweight, small tanks armed with missiles were the future. On 22 July 1960, he directed that any future tanks must not exceed 37 tons, instantly ending the 60-ton projects, Objects 277, 279, and 770. Also, there were other 130mm weapons in the 1950s and beyond, but due to changes in doctrine, most of these guns were not completed or mounted on a tank, so we're going to see each of them. Object 120, a dead end between guns and missiles. Alongside the call for a new heavy tank, political priorities also began to shift. By 1953, Nikita Khrushchev was already promoting the idea that missiles would define the future of warfare, and he pushed for armored vehicles capable of carrying them. Research on such concepts began in 1956, aiming for 2 classes: lighter missile tank destroyers of about 25 to 30 tons, and heavier missile tanks of 40 to 45 tons. The program was formally approved in May 1957 by a resolution of the Council of Ministers, but the requirements had changed in the meantime. Vehicles were now expected to cover tank hazardous approaches and engage targets at ranges of 2 kilometers or more. Greater flexibility was also introduced, allowing for the option of a conventional gun-armed tank destroyer alongside missile carriers. It was under these new terms that the Terran project was launched. 3 different design bureaus were brought together for the new project. OKB-3 at Uralmashzavod led the overall vehicle design. SKB-172 was assigned to develop the gun, and Research Institute 24 handled ammunition. By the end of 1957, 2 options had emerged: a 130mm cannon designated M68 and a 152mm cannon designated M69. Ballistically, both were quite similar, with the M68 even showing slightly better performance. However, the 130mm lacked a family of cumulative rounds, which proved decisive. The 152mm M69 was therefore chosen, and by 1960, the resulting vehicle, the SU-152 Taran, was completed with this gun. WZ-111, China's heavy tank experiment. In the same year, another project for a 130mm gun was made, but not by the Soviet Union, by China. China wanted to make a new heavy tank to replace the IS-2 in their army. alongside replacing or upgrading existing tanks like the Type 62 light tank and Type 59 medium tank. An order was placed by the Commission for Science, Technology, and Industry for national defense for the new heavy tank program. And between 1960 and 1964, various plans were made, heavily inspired by tanks like the IS-3 and the T-10. On June 10, 1964, the draft design was completed, and the tank reportedly surpassed the IS-3 and the American M103 in terms of performance, coming close to the Soviet T-10. By the following year, a hull was completed, but without a turret. This vehicle became known as the WZ-111 heavy tank. The WZ-111 was a problematic design. It weighed around 50 tons and was powered by a severely underpowered 500 horsepower engine. It featured a crew of 3, though some sources suggest early drafts proposed 4, and carried 2 14.5mm machine guns, one coaxial and another mounted above the loader's hatch. It also included an autoloader, a stereoscopic rangefinder, and several components derived from the IS family of tanks. However, the turret design was cramped, making operations difficult. Because of this and other mechanical issues, the project was canceled. Even so, at least 8 upgrade proposals were drawn up to improve the design. Most of these focused on armament improvements. The original tank was meant to use the 122mm D-25T gun, while the most ambitious proposals planned for the 130mm 59-130TA, most likely a derivative of the 130mm M46 family, with tank-specific adaptations. Ultimately, the combination of technical challenges and the global doctrinal shift from separate medium-heavy tank categories toward the main battle tank concept killed the project. Only a single hull was built, which survives today as a museum piece in Beijing. Object 172M, rifled ambitions in the MBT era. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union had standardized the 125mm smoothbore gun across its main battle tanks. Still, designers continued to explore alternatives, including the possibility of arming MBTs with a more powerful 130mm gun. The initiative came in 1970 under the promotion of Sergei Alexeyevich Zverev, then head of the Ministry of Defense Industry, who supported trials using the first 3 Object 172M prototypes. These vehicles were tested with different armament layouts: a conventional 125mm 2A26, a 130mm rifled gun with a mechanical loading system designed by the Perm machine building plant, and another 130mm gun equipped with a hydraulic lifting mechanism developed by Uralmashzavod. For reasons that remain unclear, the program was soon suspended. 3 years later, however, the concept re-emerged in the form of a mock-up tank mounting the experimental 130mm LP-28. This was followed by the Object 172MN, with the N standing for Naraznaya, which tested the improved 130mm LP-36E between 1973 and 1975. While the new weapon offered some ballistic advantages over the standard 125mm, the increase in weight, bulkier ammunition, and limited practical benefits prevented it from being adopted. By June 1975, both the Object 172MN and the related Object 172-3M were sent to Kubinka for evaluation. The conclusion was decisive. The 130mm rifled gun was not accepted for service. A smoothbore version was reportedly considered afterwards, but no reliable information has surfaced about its continuation. The Object 172MN remains one of the more mysterious Soviet tank experiments of the Cold War, a rare attempt to push beyond the 125mm standard that ultimately confirmed the balance between firepower, mobility, and practicality was better maintained with the established caliber. Object 785, a forgotten successor. In the late 1970s, another experimental main battle tank emerged, essentially an improved version of the T-80, but with 7 road wheels instead of 6. It was designed and developed by the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, under the leadership of Vershinsky. Unlike the conventional T-80, the driver's position was shifted to the left, a layout more reminiscent of the T-55 and T-62, and his primary observation device protruded through the roof. Additional features included side skirts with anti-cumulative screens, a distinctive egg-shaped turret, and even provision for the Drozd active protection system, one of the earliest Soviet hard-kill defenses. Armament options reflected the ambition of the project. One proposal centered on the 125mm 2A82 smoothbore gun, which decades later would reappear as the main weapon of the T-14 Armada. The alternative was an improved derivative of the 130mm M65 rifled cannon. An anti-aircraft machine gun complemented the main armament. However, the only prototype built was armed with the standard 125mm D81. Mobility was provided by the new engine, the MTU-2 multi-fuel diesel engine. Under ideal conditions, it could deliver up to 1,200 horsepower, though in practice it was limited to about 1,000 horsepower for reasons of reliability and service life. The fate of the Object 785 remains uncertain. At least one photograph exists of the prototype, but it is unclear whether the vehicle was scrapped or abandoned. Nonetheless, its design featured several innovations that foreshadowed later Soviet and Russian projects, influencing vehicles such as the Object 187, Object 477, and ultimately the Object 195. Beyond the 1970s experiments, alongside the projects of the 1970s and 1980s, other tanks were also proposed to carry a 130mm gun. Yet, none of these guns ever moved past the drawing board. Instead, the vehicles themselves progressed with more conventional calibers, usually 125mm smoothbores, or in some cases, 152mm guns. One such project was the T-74, a design intended to significantly improve crew habitability, ammunition stowage, and fuel supply compared to earlier Soviet MBTs. It represented an effort to balance firepower with crew comfort and logistical efficiency. Another ambitious concept was the Object 490 Poplar, envisioned as the ultimate combat vehicle. Its original aim was to maximize firepower while relocating fuel and ammunition to improve survivability. Over time, the concept shifted, placing greater emphasis on delivering protection, comfort, and firepower for the crew, a radical rethinking of the MBT's priorities in an era when Western designs were also moving toward better survivability and crew protection. AK-130, the ultimate 130mm. For our last variation of the 130mm family, there's the AK-130, probably the most over-the-top member of the whole category. Its lineage ties back to the same long-barrel artillery tradition as the M46, but the AK-130 is a naval twin-barrel automatic mounting developed at KB Arsenal beginning in June 1976. The first single-barrel prototype was the A217. The design quickly evolved into the twin-barrel A218, which became the priority project because rate of fire was a key demand from the Soviet Navy's commander-in-chief, Admiral Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov. Early trials were carried out aboard Project 956 Tsarist destroyers and continued through a long test program that lasted several years. After refinement and intensive testing, the AK-130 family was formally accepted into Soviet service on the 1st of November 1985. The double-barrel layout gives the system staggering volume of fire, theoretically up to some dozens of rounds per minute per tube, and to support sustained high rates of fire, an automatic loading system was built into the turret. That automation and the complete engineering package made the turret enormous. The whole mount approaches a weight on the order of 100 tons, once its magazines, handling gear, and control systems are counted in. Performance-wise, the AK-130 is a complete weapons suite. It integrates a modern fire control complex, target tracking radar, TV sighting, laser rangefinder, ballistic computer, target selection, and interference protection equipment, all tied into the ship's detection systems. The FCS receives target designation, measures motion parameters, computes gun guidance angles, corrects fire from splash observations, and can even automatically track projectiles to refine subsequent shoots. Ammunition was standardized across related mounts, and the gunfire is both high explosive and dedicated anti-aircraft proximity-fused rounds. Only a few direct variants exist: the AK-130 itself and the single-barrel AK-192 derivative, plus an export lightweight Chinese adaptation, the HPJ-45. The A-218 turrets equipped some of the USSR's most advanced surface combatants, installed on Project 956 destroyers and fitted to major surface units such as Project 1164 cruisers, the Slava class, and the lead Kirov-class battlecruiser, making the AK-130 one of the most formidable naval artillery installations fielded during the late Cold War. A 222 Bereg, the coastal AK-130 on wheels. Now for the ground version of the AK-130, the A-222 Bereg. Developed from the late 1970s concept to adapt naval 130mm firepower to the shore, the Bereg program matured at OKB-2 and produced its first prototype in 1988. Bereg is not a single vehicle, but a coordinated artillery complex. A typical battery comprises 4 to 6 130mm self-propelled artillery units, a mobile central command post equipped with the MP-195 fire control system, and 1 or 2 combat support vehicles carrying auxiliary power units, a small canteen and workshop kit, spare parts, and tools. Each firing vehicle is fitted with a single 130mm automatic gun mounted on an 8x8 MAZ 543M chassis. One defensive 7.62mm machine gun installation provides local protection. Technically, the Bereg adapts naval ballistics to land use. It fires high-explosive and anti-aircraft proximity-fused projectiles with an initial muzzle velocity around 850 meters per second and an effective maximum range near 23 kilometers. The gun is fully automated for loading and laying, and a single SAU can deliver sustained bursts, with practical sustained rates of fire up to about 10 to 12 rounds per minute, depending on doctrine and ammunition mix. The MAZ-based chassis is powered by a 525 horsepower diesel, giving road speeds up to 60 kilometers per hour and operational range on the order of 650 kilometers. Tactically, the Bereg fills a niche between heavy coastal missiles and light artillery. It can rapidly relocate, emplace, and deliver effective fire against small and medium surface combatants, landing forces, or shore targets. It is credited with being able to engage high-speed surface targets up to roughly 180 kilometers per hour in the littoral environment. Detection and target acquisition are handled by the MP-195 suite and organic sensors, with target detection ranges commonly cited in the order of 30 kilometers, allowing the complex to spot, designate, and engage threats before they close to their own effective weapons range. In short, the A-222 Bereg is an advanced, mobile coastal artillery complex, naval-grade firepower mounted on a road-mobile chassis, integrating automated gun laying and centralized fire control to deliver accurate, high-volume fire along the littoral, a capability that complements missile batteries by denying the nearshore approaches and providing rapid, flexible coastal defense. Across nearly a century, the 130mm caliber became a constant presence in Russian and Soviet military history. From its origins with the B-7 naval gun of 1913 to the B-13 that armed generations of destroyers through bold experiments on heavy tanks like the IS-7 and Object 279, and into the Cold War with the M-46, KS-30, and SM-2, all the way to the peaks of the AK-130 and A-222 Bereg. This single caliber adapted to every battlefield it touched. As for the games, that's something we'll dive into in the shorts format of this series, since this video already runs well over an hour. And if I missed any variant of the 130mm within the Soviet lineage and its derivatives, let me know in the comments. Just keep in mind, our focus here is on Soviet and Russian designs, even though 130mm weapons have spread worldwide, with many nations now experimenting with this caliber on modern main battle tanks. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of the 130mm cannon, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, which of these 130mm weapons surprised you the most? And stay tuned, because this was just one chapter in the ongoing story of military technology.